Nice to have you with us, Anthony, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to inspire and challenge us with. So Anthony's recorded a video, so we're going to be watching that together, and then I'm going to hand over to Catherine, who will do the Q&A with Anthony after the video. So do please put your questions, your comments in chat as you watch the video, and then we'll have a chance to have some discussion with Anthony straight after.
Yes, hello, my name is Anthony Reddie, and I work at Regent's Park College, that's part of Oxford University, and I'm also an extraordinary professor with the University of South Africa. I've been asked to share a few words around the issue of shame, and particularly its relationship to different cultural and ethnic groups. And I just want to speak for a few moments around the notion of shame within an African Caribbean context. Now, firstly, this is a very personal set of reflections, so I don't make any pretense that it speaks for every aspect of African Caribbean life or for all African Caribbean people who live in Britain and in other parts of the African and Caribbean diaspora. But on the other hand, I do think that it probably has something to say to the broader resonances of what it means to engage with shame from different cultural and theological and ethnic perspectives. So to start with, I want to go back to a key moment in my life. I was 12 years old. I was born in Bradford, West Yorkshire, and grew up in a large city centre Methodist mission called Eastbrook Hall. This was sometimes known as the Cathedral of the North. It was a massive building with a worship space that could seat about 1,000 people. And in the life of the church, one of the big set piece events was the Sunday school anniversary. And part of the anniversary was that a child, usually one of the brighter, more precocious ones, was given the responsibility of doing a reading or public recitation, really in front of the whole of the church. That would have been big, massive congregation, probably about 600-700 people. This would have been certainly late 1970s. And on this occasion, I was asked, pardon me, I was asked by the Sunday school superintendent, in agreement with my parents and an agreement with the superintendent minister, to be the person who would actually give the recitation or the reading on this particular Sunday morning for the Sunday school anniversary. Now, just put into context, my family were the only black family in this church that certainly had a membership of several hundred at that point. And one of the things I always remember back growing up in the church was this sense of what I call in my books. I call it sort of repressive representation. And repressive representation, I argue, is where people who come from minority groups have the added burden of having to represent the broader community. So whether they like it or not. I call it repressive representation because it's repressive because the one has no choice in it. It is simply a burden that is placed upon you in a way that is not the same for other more established and advantageous groups and communities. So, for example, no one expects, for example, white educated men to represent all white educated men. Therefore, if a white male fails, for example, if Boris Johnson proves to be a totally inept prime minister, and we'll skip whether that is the case or not, no one will ever say, well, there you go, you see, you simply can't trust white Oxbridge men to be in charge of the country, because the truth is he will fail as an individual. in ways that if you think back to when Barack Obama was elected as President of the United States, all the question was, well, of course, he now represents all black people. He didn't choose to. I didn't run the mandate he was going to represent all black people, but somehow he had to do that. And certainly, I was aware growing up in this church that being asked to give this speech wasn't simply about me. I was representing my family, and I was representing seemingly the whole of the black community that lived in Bradford at that time. And so the last words I remember as I sat in my Sunday best on the front row and was called to the front by the superintendent minister to speak to the whole church to give my public recitation were the words of my father, who looked at me intently and said, "Boy, don't bring no shame on our family. Don't bring shame on us." Meaning, for God's sake, do not mess up and make our family look bad in front of all these white people. As you can imagine, that did not exactly imbue me with great confidence. It did not imbue me with the confidence. Now, thankfully, I kind of got my way through the speech, but all the time I was speaking, I could feel the piercing glares of my family, particularly my father, staring at me, willing me not to mess up. It wasn't a case of we expect you to do well. It was a case of just so long as you don't bring shame on us, on our family, on our community, on the one representative group of African Caribbean people in a church of largely white middle class normality and entitlement and privilege. So I'm now 55 years old. Why do I still remember that story from when I was 12 years old? Because it was just such a epoch-making moment in my life. I just remember the pressure that I then carried ever since in terms of going to school, doing my exams, going to university, all the way through. Don't bring shame on us, i.e. other black people. The reason why I think this has remained a toxic part of the experience of being black and Caribbean is because, of course, my family, come from a long tradition that goes right back to enslavement. Reddie, Reddie, is a slave name. It's my father's name, that's why I keep it and I still revere it. But historically, people from Africa were not being called Reddie, Reddie. It was a name that speaks to, at some point, someone probably from the west coast of Scotland, that's where Reddie comes from, owned my family, owned my forebears. And therefore, one of the strictures of slavery was to be treated as a non-being, a non-human being, a chattel. People were enslaved, then responded in a whole variety of ways. And one of the quintessential ways they did that was through the Christian faith and believing that if they could provide evidence of their virtue, evidence of their respectability, evidence of their compliance, evidence of their ability to live up to the withering standards of white people's gaze at them, somehow if we could prove that we were better than the stereotypes aimed at us, then somehow we would become more human and more acceptable. Therefore, what has developed, I think, particularly within black Christian communities, black Caribbean communities, has been this sense of respectability politics. It's been this sense in which, in order to be acceptable, you have to be beyond reproach. That in order to be acceptable, you almost have to be superhuman in your spiritual and Christian virtues in order simply to make it to the starting line of being a human being and being acceptable. Therefore, what has emerged within these communities are very clear strictures around what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. It's why, for example, in terms of sexual ethics, there is still a strong element of heteronormativity. That anyone who is believed to be a deviant in the most pejorative sense of the word, i.e. anyone who's not conforming to normative Christian evangelical notions of sexuality are deemed to be problematic. It's not that black people are necessarily more homophobic than anyone else, it's just that we know what it feels like to be deemed as less than and to be a problem even before you turn up. So just turn up in a black skin makes you problematic. Therefore, one of the ways you respond to that is being hyper vigilant around how you police boundaries of who is acceptable and who isn't, and what is acceptable behaviour and what isn't. We've therefore become very prone to issues of shame. Therefore, although my father would not have known it, when he sat there and sees his eldest son about to walk up and to give a speech in front of these hordes of white people, 700 white people, in a church that is built upon notions of respectability, his central concern is, I hope my son does not embarrass me. I hope my son does not make us feel ashamed of being black by going up there and tripping over his words and making a fool of himself. He doesn't mean to be negative. It wasn't that he was not supportive of his son, but I think he was more cautious of not wanting to portray a sense of being less than or being problematic within the body politic of this church where we were the only black family. I think those historic notions of shame, as I said, they come out of racism, they come out of slavery, they come out of the problematic nature of being in a black body and being perceived as being dangerous or being a problem. We see it all the time in our contemporary context. So even in the early situation in the news around the death of George Floyd, the first thing the media did was to look at his character to see why he should be killed. Somehow, was he a person of good virtue? Was he a person of good standing? That did he have a problematic background? Somehow, as if he did, that therefore meant that he deserved to have a white officer sat on his knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That is an extreme version of shame, because I certainly heard black people who were saying that until they knew what kind of person he was, they felt unable to stand alongside a Black Lives Matter movement, because if it came out that somehow he was someone of dubious repute, that would bring shame upon us, and as if somehow he then deserved to die. Therefore, I think one of the critical things that certainly I think black communities need to wrestle with is how much of the internalized racism we have imbibed around colonialism and around the epoch of slavery that still makes us sensitive to issues of shame. That in the end of the day, part of our own freedom, part of our decolonized mind is that if we mess up because human beings mess up. And if we mess up, we don't mess up and have to represent everyone else in the wider community, because that is simply a form of repressive representation. Because no one should have the weight of having to carry the burdens of other people in your community, most of whom you don't know, but somehow they will be judged by your actions as an individual. So shame is a complex issue. It's a complex issue for many different communities, and certainly it's a complex one for black people of Caribbean descent. As I said, I'm 55 and I still remember that moment from age 12 in Eastbrook Hall, actually like it was yesterday. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this has been helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It's clear from the chat how helpful that was. I'm trying to see you on my screen, Anthony, and I haven't. Oh, you're right next to me. Yay. Okay, that makes life much easier. It's very good to meet you, Anthony, and thank you for that extremely powerful perspective on shame. And indeed, your the phrase you use, repressive representation, has been commented on a lot in the chat as something that people who are marginalized in different ways may feel. Do you want to say any more about that concept of repressive representation?
Yeah, I mean, it comes from a book I did a number of years ago called Dramatizing Theologies, where I was of looking at the use of drama and role play as different ways of looking at the intersection between practical theology and Black liberation theology. And so when I first developed that concept, it was very much within the context of Black Caribbean life. But as I think, as many people have said, that there's lots of intersections around this. And so therefore, it's not just within that particular community that exists. But certainly in the context in which the work I was doing at the time, the research I was doing was very much focusing upon those lived experiences. And I think one of the things to say is that certainly having grown up within one of the major historic churches, that's the Methodist Church, but one could say similarities with the Church of England, with Baptists and URC. In terms of other white majority churches, one of the issues about repressive representation is that then becomes one of the weights that often precludes people who don't feel overly confident from taking on positions of responsibility. Because if you know that you will be representing other people in your wider communitarian group, and therefore if you fail, it then becomes a form of representation of the failure of that entire group, then who wants that kind of pressure? And therefore it's not uncommon therefore to find, I have lots of white clergy friends who will say, Anthony, I've got a church that is very mixed, but like we just can't get Black people to become deacons, we can't get them to become readers, we can't get them to hold office in the church, as if somehow there is a deficit in the individual. It's not a deficit in the individual, it's about the way in which the construction of normality is often rested in whiteness. And by whiteness, I don't mean every white person, it's often linked by a class, it's certainly linked in terms of sexuality, it's certainly linked in terms of education. So essentially, the more privileged you are, is the more repressive representation doesn't count, because you will succeed or fail as an individual. The more marginalized you are, the more you then end up having to represent other groups, because a norm has not been established by which people like you are seen as being able to have positions of responsibility. And if all those norms are changed, then there is that sense of repressive representation. I mean, I think the final thing I would say, it's interesting the way in which I think there are parallels with gender, but I think the one critique I would make is that sometimes we make the gender comparison too blithely, because actually what we're really talking about is the absence of Black women. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Too often times I see white middle class women say, well, of course, yes, I know exactly what you mean. Well, yeah, but not really, no, because there are white middle class women in positions of responsibility. We have in the Methodist Church a number of white women who are chairs of district. We now have white women bishops. We only have one Black woman bishop, by the way. Yeah. And there are not many Black bishops, full stop. Therefore, I'm not resistant to the parallels. I'm just always slightly wary of making them too blithely without looking at the contextual differences and the way in which whiteness, I still think, is an important definer of what is a norm and what is considered to be normality.
And in relation to that, that issue of whiteness, somebody has questioned whether, with the whole Black Lives Matter campaign, and the outrage that many white people felt around the treatment of George Floyd, is there some sense there that maybe there's some constructive shame that's actually helping us as white people to question our own power, our own treatment of Black people to date? Do you think there's something around constructive shame in that?
That's an interesting question I haven't considered. Yeah, I mean, I suspect there could well be. I think for me, then the issue then is, well, what then does that constructive shame do? What praxis then emerges from that? Because I think if it's a case of we feel a sense of constructive shame, but nothing happens other than a liberal sense of guilt, but life goes on as normal, then I'm not sure how helpful it is. But actually, if it leads to activism, if it leads to solidarity, if it leads to allyship, which in a number of cases I have seen that. So I think on the most positive element of being the number of white people who have now joined Black Lives Matter movements in a way that did not happen when the movement first started 6 years ago, for example. So I think that's a positive element of it. But I think for me, it's about the praxis that arises from it that I think I'm more interested in than just the phenomena itself.
Sure, and I think there's questions here around that relationship between white people and Black people in this conversation, and how shame can work healthily or unhealthily in those conversations. And there's comments that our theological training colleges need to do a lot more around issues of Black and minority ethnic issues. Somebody's asking, say in the UK we have churches founded without Black people around the table. So do we need to start something new? Changing the system feels like an impossibly big task in such an enormous institution. So how do we challenge this systemic issue of racism in the Church of England, basically? The other churches, not just the Church of England.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, that is huge. I mean, I think I've often probably said this a few times, so to say it very quickly, I think there's two moves really around that. I think one is at an individual level. I always believe and still believe that all of us have a sense of personal agency. So if we can't change the world, what we can do is take responsibility for our own interactions and our encounter with the other, however that other is constructed. And so for me, I think the parallel I often make is with gender. So it's been working with some very, very powerful feminist and womanist friends and colleagues that have challenged me to take patriarchy seriously. It's precisely because I benefit from it that's the reason why I should critique and challenge it, and not assume that the people who are the victims of it actually should be the ones who do the heavy lifting and having to challenge it. Therefore, I think that's a parallel in terms of whiteness, that I think a simple way in which white people can be allies is to say that in your everyday interaction, especially in those places where we are not present, who is the one then who's going to raise the issue around the lack of visibility of people of colour, or the lack of inclusivity in terms of how the church works? So that, I think, is one individual thing about agency. I think the much bigger systemic thing, obviously, is a huge issue. But I think a start for me is always about the question of our so-called normality. And therefore, what I often say to people is, it's a simple question. In our ways of doing things, who's advantaged and who's disadvantaged? So, for example, if we have our meetings at 7:30 on an evening with a linear agenda that starts with number 1 and then goes down to number 15, and we have to get through all of it by the end of the meeting, and I see quite a few nods because so few of us have sat through those meetings. A basic question is, then who's advantaged and disadvantaged by both the time in which we're meeting and the way in which we're doing the business? Because actually, if you've got a church, for example, with people who do shift work, then 7 o'clock or 7:30 actually is not a good time. If you have an agenda that is a linear one that then says, okay, let's take issue 3, we'll discuss it for 5-10 minutes, and we discuss it in a way that advantages all the people who think very, very quickly and will make their points very, very succinctly, then we have a vote and then we move on. Who then does that disadvantage in the meeting, where if they're of a more reflective nature, they say, well, actually, I've got something to say now, but it's too late, like we passed that 15-20 minutes ago, and we're now on to point number 5, and we can't go backwards. There are lots of ways in which we have to examine the minutiae and some of the other structural ways in which we operate to say, but who does this advantage and who does this disadvantage? I know that part of the reason why I have become prominent in the different spaces I'm in is because I've learned to play the white game. I have been socialized enough both in that particular church as the only Black family, and then through other forms of formation in order that I can be a tokenistic representation of Blackness, but obviously not too Black, because obviously I know how to do white middle class speak and ways of operating. If we're serious about being inclusive and diverse, it then means a serious rethink actually about how we do stuff. And actually, I think that's been one of the gifts, and I use the word gift in it cautiously about this moment. I say cautiously because obviously so much devastation and death has happened that I don't want to use that term blithely or carelessly. But I think there is something about this moment that is forcing us to think about how we do things differently, because like the normal way of doing it is not possible. And maybe in those new ways of doing things, we're finding ways of being more inclusive.
Thank you. And you may already have answered this in different ways. Somebody's picking out that in Ghost Ship, Azaria France Williams talks about the fact that we need to challenge patriarchy within the church, not look separately at racism and gender issues, but patriarchy in its widest sense. Do you think that's helpful?
It is, yeah. Patriarchy, classism, and so it's a heteronormativity. Yeah, I mean, I think intersectionality is hugely important. I think the only caveat I would make, and this is not to say that we shouldn't see these things as connected, is this basic critique again about the power of whiteness. That sometimes, if we're not careful, what happens is that if one imagines all these different isms as sets of separate boxes that are all interconnected, so it's almost like a mosaic. If we're not careful, what happens is that the box marked race is the only one that actually accepts that there's whiteness. So we then got a gender, that becomes about white women. We've got a disability, that then becomes about white disabled people. We then got a queer bodies, and that then becomes more white people. As if somehow there's not diversity in all those different boxes, in all those different interconnections and all those intersectionalities. So therefore, I'm not arguing against intersectionality. It's just simply to be cautious and wary of the way in which sometimes, if we're not careful, that then almost sort of legitimates the box for race is for the black folk, and all the other boxes still belong to white people.
Yeah, no, that's very, very, yes, very sobering. And there's comments being made that actually the culture within our churches is still very white oriented. The culture of our worship, the culture of our liturgy is still very white focused. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and even when churches are significantly diverse and have lots of black bodies, they can still be that. And that, I think, is the presence of empire. Now, to be clear, all those things are not entirely wrong. I have grown up actually with particular sensibilities. I'm not overly charismatic, so forms of praise and worship in that particular style is not my thing, you know? So therefore, I think there's also a danger, again, of falling into stereotypes around what we mean by black worship, because that comes in a variety of guises, actually given the fact that black experience is very heterogeneous and there are lots of different traditions of which we've come from and been a part of. So again, I think it's also about that interrogation of not falling into stereotypes about what we mean by particular, I guess, ways of being and how we express our spirituality and our connection to the divine.
I think that's so true, because I've got some wonderful black colleagues who are far more traditional in their expression of church than I am, in terms of loving book of prayer, etc. And some of that has come from colonialism, but actually they're really aware of that and they still want to keep hold of it. So yeah. That's absolutely up to them. I recognize we've only got 1 minute left, Anthony. Is there anything else you'd like to say to kind of leave us with? Because again, this time with you is so precious. We know it's really short. This is the beginning of conversations. Is there anything else you'd just like to sum up with?
I think simply this really is that I think at the heart of the Christian faith that I've been taught and as I've learned it, there's always been this sense in which we are our brothers and sisters' keeper, that part of being the body of Christ, part of it being this interconnection is the fact that we are connected to one another and committed to one another. And therefore, I think one of the things I've tried to offer in this conversation is just to recognize the fact that any phenomena, whether it's shame or whether it's about human experience, that these things are always diverse. And therefore, our commitment to one another is to understand that the different narratives and the different ways in which they shape our different perspectives, even on a seemingly common phenomena. So something like shame is a part of human experience. Different communities have ways of shaming and have ways of exclusion. There's a lot in common in all those things, but as I've shown in my story, there are particular narratives and particular historical experiences that give a certain texture to a particular phenomena. I think it's important that as we do the work of being church, we are always sensitive to those different stories. And the more we can hold them in tension is the more we can then see the complexities of how they impact upon us and the world, but also how God speaks into those different experiences. And I think, hopefully, I hope that my story has enabled us to do that this morning.
Your story has been extremely, I say, powerful and thought-provoking, and thank you again for its personal nature. And as people have been commenting again in the chat, often shame comes out of a lack of relationship, a lack of understanding and othering, and it's in relationship with others, with God, within ourselves that we are healed. So bless you, Anthony. Thank you so much for your presence here today.